Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the March 27th installment of the 2026 Fridays with a Forester webinar series, Recognizing, Preventing, and Managing Oak Wilt. Webinar hosts today are myself, Peter Deezer. I'm the Extension Educator for Forest Dependent Wildlife based out of the Moorhead Regional Office and sitting in for Gary Wyatt today. Lauren Bacchus is with Extension Regional Support based out of Andover, and she's also with us today to help moderate this webinar. I'm very excited to introduce Grace Haynes. Grace is an oak wilt researcher and extension educator with the University of Minnesota, and as I mentioned, today she will discuss recognizing, preventing, and managing oak wilt. I have just a couple quick things to share. Please share your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat. The webinar will end promptly at 10 a.m. We will do our best to end at 10 a.m., though occasionally we go slightly over. This webinar will be recorded and posted on z.umn.edu/Fridays. And I'm going to put a couple other things in the chat as well. For our this webinar will be recorded and posted, but also the U of M Extension website and the My Minnesota Woods newsletter. So let me do that now as I introduce Grace. Grace, can you please share your screen with us?
Thanks everyone so much for coming today. I'm excited to talk to you about oak wilt. As Peter mentioned, I'm Grace Haynes. I'm an extension educator at the University of Minnesota, and my focus is oak wilt. Before we get started, I want to kind of give you an idea of what to expect for the presentation. So this is kind of like our roadmap. I'll start by talking about oaks, kind of why we care about them, and oak wilt, the primary threat, so a little bit of that biology. Then I'll talk about how oak wilt spreads, which is important for understanding how we would prevent and manage it. And both of these next two pieces have a below ground component and an above ground component. That might make a little more sense once I get to those pieces. And then I want to close by giving you kind of a very concrete set of steps you can do if you do find oak wilt on your property. And then I'll take any questions. Feel free to pop the questions into the Q&A like Peter mentioned as well as I'm going. And then all of this to kind of help you follow along is going to be shown at the bottom of the screen here. That'll kind of help you keep track of where we are. So I'll start by talking about oaks. Why are oaks so important? I believe that as members of our ecosystem, oaks and all species have intrinsic value, but there are also a lot of pragmatic reasons why we should care about oaks as well. Oaks, according to a study from 2016, they provide the highest climate and air quality regulation of any tree lineage in the United States. Under climate change, they're also projected to do particularly well. So they're projected to survive well in our changing climate and ecosystem. And there are particularly diverse insect, bird, and fungal communities that are associated with oak forests as well. So there's lots of reasons to care about them beyond just loving them as beautiful trees. Um, hmm. And now I'll get into oak wilt. So oak wilt is a fungal pathogen. It's caused by this fungus pictured in a plate here. This is what that fungus looks like when it's isolated. It's called Bretziella figaciearum, and it causes wilt-like symptoms and eventually death in oak trees. So this photo here shows two different species of oaks that are showing those kind of wilty symptoms. So on the left, we have a bur oak. It's got kind of these toasted looking leaves up at the top. And then on the right side, we have a red oak, which also has kind of these toasted looking leaves in the canopy. And that also kind of demonstrates that oak wilt can affect all species of oaks. So no species of oaks are immune to oak wilt. These maps show oak wilt's distribution in the country and then also in Minnesota specifically. So in the big map, we have the detections throughout the country. Basically, these are by county. The green counties show places where we've detected oak wilt. So it's kind of spread through a lot of the Midwest and extending a little east and a little south into like Oklahoma, Texas area. Then on this inset of Minnesota, we have a little more information where these darker greens correspond to more detections of oak wilt by county in Minnesota, and then the lighter greens correspond to fewer detections. So you can kind of see from this that oak wilt is really clustered and most common in the eastern side of the state, particularly more so in the southeast. But it is spreading north and west. One thing that's important to know about oaks when we talk about oak wilt is that although oak wilt can affect any species of oak, there are some oaks that are more susceptible than others. So the genus Quercus, which is oaks, is generally divided into two different groups. So we have the red oak group and the white oak group. And that's not to be confused with the species red oak and the species white oak. This slide kind of shows you the broad differences between those two groups. So on the left side, we have the red oak group. These are species that typically, the easiest way to tell them apart is they have kind of these pointier lobes on their leaves. And so here we have the two most common species of red oaks in Minnesota. So we have the northern pin oak and a northern red oak. Then on the right side of the screen, we have the white oak group. So these are characterized by having more rounded lobes. And the most common species in Minnesota of the white oak group are bur oaks and then white oak, the species. Um, so as I mentioned, all oak species are susceptible to oak wilt, but oaks in the red oak group are much more susceptible. So that's going to mean they die a lot quicker. Oaks in the red oak group will usually die within weeks to months, and that the symptoms are going to be a lot easier to see on the red oak group. In the white oak group, it's a lot more variable. So bur oaks within the white oak group can survive for up to like 7 years, although they do usually still die from oak wilt. And then white oaks, the species, can survive for many years after getting oak wilt with just kind of branches dying off. Um, so I'm going to get into oak wilt symptoms next, but as we talk about those symptoms, you want to kind of remember that they're almost always going to be easier to see on species in the red oak group compared to species in the white oak group. So let's get into species symptoms. There are a lot of different things that can harm oak trees in Minnesota, and sometimes it can be kind of hard to be certain what's going on with your oak. So I'm going to give you the three kind of main symptoms of oak wilt that you should keep an eye out for. And when you take all three of these together, it's usually a pretty good indication that oak wilt is what's harming your oak trees. Um, so all of these symptoms are going to start showing up in mid-July and continue. They'll be most apparent in July and August. The first one to keep in mind is top-down canopy wilting. So here we have that same photo from before. Basically, at the canopy level, when we start seeing these kind of discolored leaves, we're going to start seeing those most when the disease begins at the top and kind of outside of the canopy. So we have in this photo, if you can see kind of at the top and the outside, we have all these really toasted looking leaves. Then if you look closer to the bottom of the canopy, some of those leaves are still pretty green. Um, and then as the disease progresses, these symptoms will also kind of move inward and downward in the canopy. And again, that's going to be true on both red oak species and white oak species, but the progression happens a lot more quickly on red oaks. And this is an important symptom to keep in mind when you're comparing to bur oak blight, which is another fungal pathogen of oak trees that's present in Minnesota. On bur oak blight, a species with bur oak blight is going to have symptoms starting at the bottom of the canopy and working their way up. So if you see a species that only has a few leaves up at the top of the tree, but it's shed a lot of the other ones, that's probably bur oak blight, not oak wilt. The second symptom is on the leaves. So the leaves that have leaves on oak trees that have oak wilt will have a couple of different kinds of discoloration. They might look kind of bronzed, like this photo, or they might look kind of waterlogged, or even just like a little bit duller, the color on the leaves. And then that's going to also start toward the edges of the leaves and then work its way inward, eventually leaving this little area here where you'll just see kind of a tiny little patch of healthy looking leaf toward the middle and bottom of the leaf. And we sometimes call those leaf islands or islands of green. And then finally, early season leaf drop is really characteristic of oak wilt. So some oak diseases will cause oaks to actually hold on to their leaves longer, and oak wilt is not one of them. So when an oak tree has oak wilt, usually shortly after you start to see these first two symptoms, you'll see a lot of the leaves being shed on the ground. So this photo is from mid-July. Of course, oak trees drop their leaves in the fall, like all deciduous trees, but if you start seeing that leaf drop really early in the season when it's clearly not from just normal senescence, that's typical of oak wilt. And then this photo also kind of has a bonus where if you zoom in, you can see on these leaves in the photo that they're starting to show that like marginal bronzing kind of on the edges of the leaves. So oak wilt primarily spreads by below ground root connections. And so another thing to keep in mind is that the pattern of oak wilt death and spread is going to be kind of radial. So this photo shows that at a landscape level where in the center of this oak wilt infection center, we have all these dead trees. Those are trees that died in previous years. The yellow ring around them is oaks that have been infected the current year, the year that this photo was taken. And then if this oak wilt gap is not treated, that will likely spread to the green oaks surrounding it in the following year. So if you see a species or oak damage that instead is showing up in kind of patches or on individual trees that are further away from each other, that's more likely to be something that's not oak wilt, like bacterial leaf scorch, which may still have similar leaf symptoms. Um, now, on all of these, you might not see really clear cases, especially on white oak species. And so if that's the case, you can send in a sample from your oak tree to the plant disease clinic at the University of Minnesota. And they can do an entire panel of oak disease and be able to tell you for certain what's going on with your oak trees. So, before we can talk about prevention and management of oak wilt, it's really important for us to understand how it spreads. And that has below ground and above ground components. And I'll start with the below ground component. So, oak trees have this amazing ability to form grafts with their roots. Usually, this happens between oaks of the same species, but it's theoretically possible between oaks and other oak species. Um, and basically, this allows them, this photo on the right side is what those grafts look like once they're excavated. Usually, this allows them to share resources and nutrients, but in the case of oak wilt, that also allows the spores of the disease to spread from an infected oak to any of its healthy neighbors that it has grafts with. And that's kind of what causes this radial spread that you see in this photo on the left side. Um, so that's below ground spread. New infection centers, like the one from the previous slide, are started when oak wilt spreads above ground. So that's how oak wilt usually spreads further distances rather than just from a central tree to its neighbors. So above ground oak wilt spread happens when native sap feeding beetles called nitadulids, like this one pictured here, when they find spores from the fungus and then transport them to freshly cut wounds on oak trees. So these beetles are very small. They can be as small as 2 millimeters up to 12 millimeters long. There's a few different species. You might be wondering, how do they find the spores of these oak trees? After dying from oak wilt, about 50% of red oaks will form what's called a spore mat. And that looks like this here. This is if you were to peel the bark away. And so there's a few different components of the spore mat that you can pay attention to. First, we have just like this huge collection of spores. That's this kind of like dusty looking black color here. Sometimes that'll be gray when it's fresher. Um, and then the fungus will also create this little pressure pad here. That's going to add layer after layer after layer of sterile tissue, basically until it creates enough pressure under the bark to cause the bark to crack. So if we hadn't excavated that, that would look something like this, where we basically have this vertical slit in the bark that was created when the enough pressure built up underneath it that it forced the bark to kind of crack. It might also look like this. And this crack and opening in the bark is important for the above ground oak wilt spread because that's what makes the spore mat accessible to these nitidulid beetles. So this spore mat has a really sickly sweet smell. And so these beetles will be able to detect that and then they'll crawl into one of these cracks that happens, roll around in the spores and get the spores all over them. Those beetles are also drawn to and feed on tree sap. So if there's then a fresh wound on an oak tree, like after an oak has had wind damage, or if someone trims an oak at the time that these beetles are flying, um, then if one of these nidadula beetles has found a spore mat rolled around in it, and then finds a fresh wound on an oak tree, it will deposit the spores from the spore mat onto the fresh wound and then create a new infection center starting at that tree that just received the spores. So that's essentially how oak wilt spreads. And so when we think about prevention and management, we're really trying to cut off one of these two mechanisms of spread. Unfortunately, there's not a super effective way to treat or cure a tree that has been infected with oak wilt. And so when we talk about prevention and management, we're really thinking about managing for the spread of it rather than curing a tree that has been infected. So we're going to start by talking about prevention and management of below ground transmission. It's important to do that first, and this is basically relevant if you have already found oak wilt on your property. So your goal then is to prevent it from spreading as soon as possible so that any neighboring trees near it won't be infected. And this is a pretty like crude management strategy. Basically, we're just trying to like sever those root grafts. So we want to make it so that we're gonna cut off the connection that allows the fungus to spread from a diseased tree to a healthy tree near it. And there are a few different tools that'll help you sever those root grafts, and I'll go through them. The most common tool used for this is a vibratory plow. This is the most effective tool for the job. Um, and I'm going to show a video of that. Basically, this is this huge machine. It plunges this 5 foot long blade into the ground um, and then drags it through the roots of in between the infected trees and the healthy trees. And basically, that's going to sever the root grafts and make it impossible for that fungus to spread. The vibratory plow causes the least damage to a site, but it can be expensive or hard to source. Not everybody has access to this. So an alternative is called a trencher. This is a similar tool. You want to get a trencher that has at least a 5 foot blade still, and trenchers can be rented from a lot of hardware stores like Home Depot or Menards, and you can operate them yourself. So if you're not able to access a vibratory plow, a trencher is a good alternative. Now, regardless of which of these you're going to use, your next step is placing a plow line. And that's basically just deciding where you're going to run your vibratory plow or dig your trench. When you're placing a plow line, the basic idea is, so in this figure we have infected trees that are showing symptoms represented by this kind of brown canopy. And then healthy looking trees that are adjacent to those infected trees are this lighter green. And then uninfected oak trees are this darker green. So when you're placing your plow line, you usually are going to want to place it around not only the visibly infected trees, but also a buffer zone of 1 or 2 rings of healthy oaks that are near them. And so that's basically that will create a gap in your forest, but it should also stop this disease in its tracks before it continues to infect additional trees around it. There is one additional method that a lot of land managers use hoping to prevent below ground spread, and that's called girdle herbicide. And that's pretty much what it sounds like. You're girdling your trees and then applying herbicide. So this is a method, it definitely kills the infected trees. And the hope is that the herbicide application will also kill the root systems and prevent it from spreading. There's a few land managers who use this in the upper Midwest and have reported some success, but it has not been thoroughly studied. So we don't really have the scientific evidence backing this yet, although we do have some reports that it's been effective. And another advantage of this is that it's, of course, definitely cheaper than renting a vibratory plow or a trencher. Um, I have 2 roles in my job, and so I do not only extension on oak wilt, but also some research. And so, actually, a piece of my research side of my job is an ongoing study that's looking at the efficacy of, and mechanics of this method. So we're still in the really early stages, but we're basically trying to figure out, does applying herbicide after girdling or felling a tree actually kill the root systems faster than just girdling or felling that tree on its own? We don't have any data yet, but we will certainly be letting people know once we have more. So once you have figured out your below ground spread, you're going to focus on this other piece, above ground spread. And I'll remind you that happens when these nidodulid beetles carry spores from diseased oak trees to fresh wounds on healthy oaks. So there's a couple different things you can do for above ground spread in different circumstances. First, I'm going to talk about just straight up prevention. This is basically for people who don't have oak wilt on their property yet. This is when you're like trying not to get it in the first place. Um, and the best thing you can do for prevention is think about when these nidodulid beetles are flying. They are active in the spring, and that is also a time when these spore mats can be present. And so basically, so the helpful phrase that you can remember is don't prune April, May, and June. So in these months, you want to make sure that you are not causing any active wounds on your oak trees so that that way the beetles have nowhere to deposit those spores. The problem with this phrase is that it's actually also most effective to not prune in July either. That phrase doesn't rhyme, but it is more true than don't prune April, May, and June. Um, and so, as a piece of this not pruning, you also want to make sure that you're not felling any trees that are in proximity to oak trees, basically because that can lead to accidental wounding on the oaks around them. Now, of course, sometimes oak wounds occur accidentally, or you might have to prune your oak tree during this time for power lines or something like that. And wind damage can occur, etc. So if this happens, if an oak wound occurs during this time, there's still hope. You can paint over that wound immediately after it happens. And paints that you can use that will help kind of protect the wound from spores are pruning paint, water-based paint, or shellac. And it's really important to do this as fast as you possibly can because we have observed these beetles finding fresh wounds within 10 minutes of them occurring. So if you have like an oak or a woodland that's small enough for you to monitor it and you want to protect it, I would recommend maybe even having these paint options on hand. And if a windstorm occurs or something, then you can kind of go out and find any fresh wounds that have happened. And that the risk for a fresh wound is between 10 minutes and up to 5 days later. So if you find a really old wound, the risk has already passed. You just want to make sure that you're getting these. If you can paint over them within 5 days, then that's still minimizing your risk. Now, if you have already gotten oak wilt on your property, there's different ways that you want to prevent above ground spread. So this is kind of post-infection. So this is basically if you found oak wilt and you've already done your below ground management with a trencher or a vibratory plow, you want to help prevent these spore mats from forming and so that then you're preventing further spread above ground. So you're either preventing spore mats from forming or you can hide them from these nidodulids. And I'll remind you that spore mats only occur on red oak species, and they happen on about half of the red oak trees that die from oak wilt within a year of them dying. And basically what this means is that you have to be really cautious about what you do with infected wood for the first year after that tree has died. So we're going to revisit this same diagram from the below ground spread. After you've cut this plow line, you're going to start thinking about what you're going to do with the trees inside of it. And there are a couple different ways that you can handle this. And a lot of those decisions are going to depend on what your budget is, your capacity, and then there are certain land settings that might make some management methods more appropriate than others. So one option that's probably safest is to remove all of the trees within the treatment boundary, and that's called cut to line. So basically, you're not only cutting down these visibly infected oak trees, but also the oak trees that surround them, anything within this plow line. Now, the pros of this are you only have to do tree removal once. You can kind of have someone come out there and fell all of these trees in one go. But the cons are if any of these trees, these healthy looking oaks that are within the plow line maybe are not grafted to the central trees, you might be sacrificing more trees than you want to. So an alternative is called monitor and remove. Basically, some land managers will come to a site after they've cut their plow line. They'll remove the visibly infected oaks and then they'll revisit these sites year by year. So if they come back the next year and then these two oaks are showing symptoms, they'll cut those down too and keep on doing that year to year. So the pros of this are that if any of these additional healthy looking oak trees are not infected, you might be able to save them. But the con is that you have to revisit each year. It might be more expensive to kind of do these multiple rounds of removals. And with this piece again, this is another circumstance where girdling can be used instead. And girdling in this case is very effective. Essentially, what girdling does is it causes the trees to dry out quickly enough that spore mats can't form. Spore mat formation is dependent on wood moisture. And so if you don't have the budget to have all these trees felled, you can girdle, which is a lot cheaper. But the problem with this method is if it's in a high traffic area, like near a path or near a home, these trees that you've girdled will die, and then that can kind of create these hazard trees. So this might not be an appropriate method if it's in an area that those hazard trees are liable to fall on someone or a structure. So after you've removed your wood, if you've removed your wood, you have to still take care of the wood that you removed. Basically, spore mats can form on diseased wood even after that wood has been removed. And so you have to treat that wood really carefully. Some options for treating that wood are chipping it. You can burn it. You can kiln dry it. And if you don't have access to any of the tools that would do this, you can also cover them um, in a heavy tarp and make sure that you bury the edges. So I'll remind you these nitadulids are very small, and so you want to make sure if you're doing this method that it's a thick enough tarp that it's not going to create any rips that these beetles can come in um, and find the wood from, and that's why we're burying the edges as well. So under this tarp, the wood may still be forming spore mats, but by creating this barrier, you're making it so that these beetles are not able to access the spore mats. Um, Also, don't move firewood. This is a way that oak wilt can be spread if some of this firewood might be from an infected tree. But not moving firewood is also just a good practice for any kind of forest health. So there's a lot of other invasive species that can easily be spread via firewood. This is a way that emerald ash borer has been spread to different areas. So um, at, just don't move firewood for any reason. You should make sure that you're burning wood in the county that you bought it. Or that it was produced, and that if you are going to another county to camp, don't bring wood with you, purchase your wood there. So to close, I want to send you away with a really clear list of action items for what to do if you find oak wilt on your property. The first thing you want to do is confirm oak wilt infections, and you can do that through the University of Minnesota Plant Disease Clinic. So this QR code will take you to their submit a sample page, and that will have specific instructions on how you submit a sample. Basically, what you want to do is, first of all, it's important to make sure you're collecting samples from actively wilting branches. You can get a false negative if you're collecting from a branch that is not showing active wilt. If possible, include 3 to 5 branches, but not more. And then the size of your samples should be between 1 and 4 inches. You don't want your branch diameter to be greater than 4 inches. And then the length of the branch should be under 4 feet. And then this analysis for oak diseases broadly is going to cost about $95. And then it's also really important that you seal the wound where you took the sample. Basically, if that tree does not actually have oak wilt, if you're creating a fresh wound, you may be opening a way for it to get oak wilt. So as you're collecting this, especially if you're not sure that it's oak wilt already, you want to make sure you seal that wound. So if it's not oak wilt, you can still protect the tree. Once you have confirmed your infection, you want to make sure you report oak wilt to the DNR. So this map shows, again, oak wilt spread within Minnesota. So this darker red, maroon color shows areas where oak wilt is already common. So if you're in one of those areas and you find oak wilt, you don't need to tell the DNR. They already know it's there. But if you find oak wilt in one of these kind of cross-hatched areas, those are areas that are at the most significant risk of new oak wilt infections. And of course, if you find oak wilt in one of these areas that's not shaded at all, you want to make sure that you report that to the DNR, which you can find your DNR contact with at this link. And that just helps us keep track of where the disease is so that we can be tracking it and understand where we need to be putting our most energy. It's also encouraged, besides reporting to the DNR, to report through EDMAPS. This stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System, and this is an app, or I believe you can also report on their website that keeps track of a lot of different invasive species. And so similarly, that's just going to help folks who are paying attention to where this disease is catch any new infections. So once you have reported it, you'll create a plan for your oak wilt management. So that's kind of looking at all of the things that I outlined in prevention and management, just kind of thinking about which ones are appropriate for your setting. So that might look like seeing if you can find access to a vibratory plow, deciding whether you're going to remove trees or girdle them, and figuring out what you're going to do with that infected wood. Now, I mentioned vibratory plows can be hard to access and all of this can be a little expensive, but if you're in one of these significant risk areas, this is another reason to report to the DNR because they have cost share options for people who are on this leading edge. Because that it's really important for us to slow the spread as much as possible. We have allocated a lot of funds to helping people on those leading edges treat it to hopefully keep it from spreading as much as possible. And so when you report this to your local forester at the DNR, they can advise you about what cost share options are available. So that's all I have. I think maybe I talked a little faster than I expected, but I'm ready to take any questions that you'll have, and maybe be able to have kind of a broader discussion that is focused on what you're all curious about and what you all want to know about Oak Wilt. And then I'll leave this up. This is my information. If you have any other questions that come up, you can always feel free to reach out to me and ask me them.
Thank you, Grace. That was
Mhm.
great. And we do have a ton of time for questions, which is also awesome. I see many in the Q&A. If you have additional questions, please feel free to share them there, and I will just jump into some of them. Um, so one first question was kind of like the spread within a county. So how prevalent is oak wilt in northern Pine County and Carlton County? But follow-up might be how quickly is it spreading into additional regions of the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think so. This is Pine County, and I believe what was the other county? Carlton. I think this one's
Carlton.
Carlton County.
Yep.
And so Oakville is present in a little bit of Pine County, but that's kind of the leading edge of it. And so that's an area where you want to be really, really cautious and paying really close attention, because although it's not widespread within that area yet, the entire county is at risk. Um, and then I think, I mean, Carlton County is also at risk, but is a little further away. Nittidoodle beetles usually only fly about half a mile, but these buffer zones are, I believe, 20 miles. And so that's kind of just to like have a generous swath where we're paying attention, just in case. I don't think that is how far Nittidoodle beetles are able to fly, but it's how far they usually fly is half a mile. So oak wilt generally spreads really slowly. It's been present in the state since the 40s, and this is how far it's spread. And I think a lot of that has to do with, first of all, the fact that the majority of spread happens via that below ground root grafting, connected root systems. And so in that case, it's really only going to be able to spread from like an infected tree to whatever trees it's grafted to. And I think it usually will, I don't believe that it's likely to spread like multiple trees away. There's a little bit of variability in that because, excuse me, grafting patterns, the way that root grafting happens is a little bit different depending on the soil type. Um, And so it's likely to travel a little bit further if you're in sandier soils. That just makes grafting a little bit more common. But generally speaking, oak wilt spreads pretty slowly because it usually spreads via connected trees, and even when it doesn't, it's spreading by these beetles that don't usually fly super far.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mhm.
Um, there's a whole bunch of questions, so just bear with me, everyone.
Yeah,
In a
absolutely.
suburban
Great.
setting, with only one or two trees in the yard. Do you need to sever
Mhm.
the roots? How close before you need to consider doing that? And then the next question is kind of a
Hmm.
good follow-up. Can trenchers or vibratory plows spread it? Should you clean them? Should they be cleaned before you use them if you rent them?
I don't believe that that is a big concern because this is a disease that really can't survive very long. There's different kinds of fungal diseases, and some of them are better able to survive outside of a host. Oak wilt is really dependent on live host material, and which is why a lot of these like this study on looking at the girdle herbicide method is really looking at how long root systems survive because the fungus really needs like a live tissue as a reservoir for it to survive. Obviously, it can survive for a little bit outside of a host. That's why these spores can be transported by the beetles. But I don't believe that it's a big concern about cleaning. That is something, though, if you are figuring out a vibratory plow from like the DNR, that's something that they will have considered and be able to advise you on as well. Um, as for how close they have to be, again, that's kind of going to depend on your soil type. Um, One a good resource that I believe has been shared in the chat is the DNR's Oak Wilt Guide. It's a PDF and it is super, super thorough. So in that, there's like 10 different scenarios where they're like, you have one isolated oak tree in a yard, and this is what you'll have to do. You're on sandy soils, this is what you have to do. And that'll tell you kind of about the buffer zone that you need to think about. I would say if you only have one tree and there's no surrounding oaks, you probably don't have to sever the roots. If you have two trees, it maybe kind of depends on how cautious you want to be about whether those trees are like how important is it to you to save the other oak tree that it might be close to? And if you want to be really cautious about that, then it might make sense to sever those roots. Some of that is going to depend on how close they are together, and that is going to be more dependent on your soil type. So I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but if you're on sandier soils, then that distance is going to be a lot longer that you have to worry about root grafting. And if you're on more clay-rich or loamy soils, you might have to worry a little bit less about grafting.
Thank you. And then with a 2-year-old pin oak, again, just following up on the same question, um, the root system is not large. You can just kind of cut that once it has it, if it's not adjacent to other oaks, and that should be all you need to do with that.
Sorry, could you repeat what's the
Just a
question?
small pin oak, since the root system
Oh,
is not
oh, oh.
large, just cut it up and burn the debris.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, actually, pulling up the root systems is a really effective method. It's just normally like you have to have access to a whole excavator and it's really damaging. But if it's just a really small tree and that's easy to do, that's a great method.
And it does beg the question about since oaks sprout when cut.
Mm,
Do you encourage them to still treat the stump? And if so, with what kind of
yes.
treatment?
Uh,
That way it'll kill the root system as well and
mhm.
limit transmission. Is that right?
There have been reports, I think, from Michigan of after they've cut trees, they'll because oaks form root sprouts from or stump sprouts. I mean, there have been reports of some of the sprouts like already growing up with oak wilt, and so it's actually encouraged also to kind of paint herbicide on a stump after you've stumped a tree. And that's also outlined in that DNR oak wilt guide. Not to be a broken record about it. The as for the herbicide, the one that's normally used is triclopyr, and so the brand name, I think the most common brand name for that is Garlon. And but yeah, triclopyr is the most commonly used herbicide. There are a couple other ones that can work, but I believe triclopyr, aka Garlon, is like kind of the gold standard for that.
And is there any fungicide that is effective against the spores?
That is a great question that I actually have a supplemental slide on. It's not as pretty as the rest of my slides. There is a fungicide. This is not. normally recommended because it's very expensive and it can't cure a tree, most trees that have already been infected. Um, it can be used for prevention. And so like an example that, and this is also outlined in that PDF. So an example that they use is like if you have two trees in your backyard and they're really high value, one of them gets oak wilt, that might be a good time for you to treat the other tree. You have to apply this fungicide every other year and it's very expensive. But it can be effective if you have like a really high value tree that you're really concerned about. It can be used preventatively, mostly on red and bur oaks, but on Quercus alba, the white oak species, not what the white oak group, that can be injected after initial symptoms, and it will still. You should still apply that every other year, but that can keep a white oak alive for longer. It's better to hire a professional, but it is possible for you to do this on your own. There's a lot of instructions for how to inject that tree yourself.
Awesome. Thank you. A ton of amazing
Mhm.
questions here, so we'll just keep
Yeah.
going. We had oak wilt diagnosed in by county forester in Hubbard County. So you mentioned, where they can go to report that.
Hmm.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about identifying it in your neighborhood and the best way to let people know?
Uh,
Is that through
yeah.
EdMaps?
Oh, yeah. I thought, sorry, for some reason I thought let your neighborhood know, like as if
Well, yeah,
if there's,
you
but
let
yeah,
your neighbor know, but
yeah. So yeah, for identifying it, for confirming it, I always point to the University of Minnesota Plant Disease Clinic if you're not sure. The symptoms you're going to look for are those top-down canopy symptoms, outside in leaf death or leaf discoloration, and then early season leaf drop. Those are the main things to keep an eye out for. And then, yeah, we encourage everybody to report it through EdMaps. And that's going to be the best way to let the majority of people know. And then EdMaps, I believe that that ends up going through and getting reviewed by the Department of Agriculture, and
Mhm.
then that there's a map that's publicly available where you can see where detections have occurred within the state. And that's countywide. And so this map that's put out by the DNR is, I think, a little bit more nuanced in what it's conveying about risk. But it will tell you like where individual occurrences have happened if you look at that map from EdMaps.
And then kind of another two-parter, combining a couple questions here. Once symptoms appear, how quickly must an infected tree be girdled in order to effectively, dry it out and prevent the spread and the formation of those fungal maps? But also, how do you know when severing, you're too late in severing the roots and maybe need to extend the diameter of what you're considering to cut?
Um, those are very good questions. And I think some of this, there are cases where people will sever the roots and then it'll kind of, it's called a line jump. You'll put your plow line and then you'll still find it on the other side. And it can be really, it's really hard to know what's going on below ground. We don't really have a good method for like being able to tell who's grafting to who. We know that oak trees can form root grafts, but we don't always know which trees are grafted to which other trees, and that's we don't really have a good method yet for figuring that out. Um, I think typically what land managers do is they will start treatment in the fall. And I think the reason why that's kind of the timeline is because you want to be cautious about like as you're treating, as you're using the vibratory plow or a trencher, you could ding roots, etc., on trees that are not yet infected. And so I think usually this is most of the folks I know who are managing large tracts of land will do their surveys in July and August and then do their treatment in the fall. And so I think even like I would say maybe don't try and treat it in like early don't try and treat it in the spring because you might not be seeing the extent of it, but you will probably see symptoms on it by July or August of that year. And so I would say, yeah, the fall after you first notice symptoms is a good time to do it. Um, and then let me see. Uh, what was the other piece of that question? I know there's another part that I'm forgetting
Oh, I'm
now.
sorry. I was teeing up the next
No, no, it's great. It's
question.
great. Um,
I think we can just continue on.
okay.
Um, so a couple that we've answered that I'll just touch on quick. Can oaks of different species root graft? I believe you answered that as yes, theoretically. Is
Yeah,
it
that is
possibly a
like
little less common?
there's kind of like I was asked this question a week ago at a conference, and I thought that the answer was no, absolutely not. And since then, I've asked a bunch of like um, more senior experts in the field, and it seems like there's kind of a debate there where I think the people who are like the capital E experts on oak wilt say yes, it's theoretically possible, but I don't think that we have a single case of like actually having witnessed that happen. And so it's like if you're being the most cautious, you want to treat those roots as if they theoretically could graft. That
Mhm.
is the way that you can be certain that you're preventing it, but it's highly unlikely that they would do that.
Do you think purchased stock, if you're buying, seedlings from nurseries or soil and water conservation district plant sales, um, what's the prevalence of oak wilt on seedlings that you may purchase?
I mean, any age of oak can be infected by oak wilt, but I would say that is probably a really, really low risk because the DNR takes oak wilt very seriously, and because for it to have been infected, it probably would have had to be grafted to something else. So I would not be concerned about it being spread by purchasing seedlings.
And then a couple questions on firewood. Thank you for answering so
Mm.
many of these.
Oh
Is it
yeah, that's
always
our
a
list.
potential? Is it always a potential host, or like if it dries out, does it become usable or storable? Um, it's someone has indoor storage for firewood. It's not sealed, but is that good enough to keep it away from their trees?
I mean, I would say if you know that the wood comes from a diseased tree, I would say be really cautious with that. You can kiln dry it if you debark it. There's some guidance on like I think if it's cut to like less than 4 inches and it's piled loosely for like an entire season, um, it's I think that's considered safe, and there's a lot of like really nitty-gritty details on that in that PDF, the 25-page long PDF with all the information. So that might be good enough, but I would say like I would just be really, really cautious with any wood that you know is diseased.
Yep.
If you have a kiln and you can kiln dry it, then like that wood is for sure safe, or like any wood that's been certified by the MDA should be safe. But I would just don't be cavalier about it.
Right. Right. Um, are there success stories in stopping the spread of it in communities or neighborhoods?
Oh yeah. I mean, if you look at, I am less familiar with examples from specific communities and neighborhoods, but
Sure.
like the Menominee Tribal Enterprises in Wisconsin has like one of the best oak wilt control um, programs that I have ever heard of, where they fly drones over their land, and so then they're able to detect it really, really early. Now that doesn't mean um, that they're curing it after they've found it, but the faster that you can find it and the sooner that you can isolate that tree, the better chance you have of it not spreading to the rest of your land. And like certainly like the reason why we're recommending all this control and felling all those trees, it's like it is heartbreaking to see a big gap in your canopy from having had to fell all these oaks, but we do that because it's effective, and that can protect a lot of the oaks around it. And so there's a lot of places like for my research side of my job, I work really closely with Three Rivers Parks, and they have a pretty robust oak wilt control program as well. And so we've visited a lot of sites that previously had oak wilt, and there is a gap in the canopy, but the oak trees surrounding it are healthy. So like these are effective methods, even though unlike some other diseases where you can actually cure the individual tree, we can't do that, but like we can stop it and protect the trees around it. So like this, it's not it's an important disease to be aware of, but it's not like our oaks aren't doomed even as oak wilt spreads. Like there's still things that we can do to keep them healthy and safe and to keep oaks as a part of the landscape, even in areas where oak wilt is common.
Great. Um, and where do the beetles overwinter? Do they, as larvae underneath the bark, or also
Great
does
question.
prescribed fire help keep the beetle numbers down?
These are really great questions. Okay, so I believe that the beetles overwinter in the duff. So that's like the organic layer of soil, like right at the base of trees. And so the beetles have been a lot less studied than the fungus. This is like I'm my training is as a forest entomologist, and I have heard it kind of said that like this is like a plant pathologist disease. And so there's been a lot more work done on like the fungus part of it rather than the beetle side. But I think they overwinter in the duff, and fire on the landscape is like a big piece of the story of oaks on the landscape in Minnesota. The oak wilt, I think there's a lot of different components of this kind of, but areas like oak savannas tend to be less potentially less impacted by oak wilt. I don't know if this research has been done yet, but I'm really curious about like whether the fact of using fire on the landscape could eliminate some of the beetles like in the duff on the ground and make it harder for them to spread. I do think a piece of why the beetles have been less studied is because they're a native species, so they're a part of our ecosystem, and whereas the fungus is thought to be non-native, and so the beetles are not, I guess, the way we think about it typically, we don't really think of the beetles as the problem so much as the fungus, because the beetles are also like interacting with the whole rest of our ecosystem in like a healthy and balanced way. It's just that they happen to also vector this disease. That was
And so,
kind of like scattered answer, but maybe I hit some of those questions in
no,
there.
it's good. And so, but it does kind of lead into another question. There's many, so I've lost exactly where it's located. But
Mhm.
can can oak wilt get into non-oak species? And if so, like what are the effects? Can it stay there, just to be stored there and then vectored into additional oak species? Is there any risk to adjacent trees and worry about storage of the fungus there?
I have not heard of that happening. I see. I don't know if this is the question you were touching on, but that it has been reported in chestnut plantings throughout the Midwest. That I'm not familiar with that, but I that doesn't mean that it's not happening. I think certainly so. I mean, chestnuts and oaks are really closely related, so I would think if it were going to impact any other species, they would be other species that are in the same family as oaks. So that's Fagaceae, which includes chestnuts. And I think, yeah, I honestly would have to learn more about that before I can answer it. Definitively, but I would think certainly species that are not closely related to oaks, I would not be concerned about it. Especially because using that trencher, like it's effective for protecting oaks, but like there is damage that's caused to the forest by using that. Like you have to cut a line so that you can pull that plow through there. And so I think if you're thinking about protecting other trees that are not really like reported to be largely impacted by oak wilt or that like are not really so much a focus. I would think that the potential damage to a site of pulling the vibratory plow through there would be greater than the risk would be greater than the reward for protecting trees that haven't historically been reported as oak wilt hosts.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Have any like resistant oaks been found? Are there any hybrids that are being developed?
That's not so much a focus of the research. There's been a lot of like artificial inoculation of different oak species um, throughout the world. I believe most, if not all, species of oaks have been like artificially inoculated with oak wilt to see if they're potential hosts, and every species that's been tested has been a potential host. That said, there there's a variety of responses in oak trees. So like with like white oaks, as in the species white oak, Quercus alba, some of them can survive for like more than 20 years with oak wilt infecting them. And so like there's kind of a variety, but it's not um, the unlike with some other forest pests and forest diseases, breeding for resistance is not really as much of a focus because all species are susceptible.
Great, thank you. Um, so you may have answered this a little bit already, but can you speak to just like a radius if you don't see an infected tree, and there's sort of a buffer there? Is there ever a possibility that infection has spread and some trees are not showcasing any outward signs of it yet?
Um, I think mm, I think symptoms are usually pretty apparent.
Okay,
Um, I
from
think
the
you
point
you
of
you
infection.
typically would not have to worry about like a hidden case of oak wilt. I would say like again, like that's the timing of oak wilt showing up is uh kind of a piece of that. And I suppose to some extent, yes, like that's why we have, I'll go back to the buffer zone. That's why we have this buffer zone around here is
Right.
because theoretically these trees could have been infected. Um, but I wouldn't worry about like this tree being affected. Like there are different radii that you may want to consider a different radius of infected um, or potentially infected trees depending on your soil type. But I wouldn't worry about like a tree way over here having been secretly infected all that way.
Great. And we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions, and we had a ton of time. So would you please just put up your email address
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
that we'll try to get through as many as we can. We'll use every minute we have.
This is
Um,
it, ahaynes@umn.edu.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Um, let's see. Can you touch again just on the months? We have a couple questions about the months who came for folks who came in late,
Yes.
that it's safe to prune. And
Hmm.
you had mentioned up till June, but also just like if we want to be completely sure, what months
Yeah,
should
so
we
it's
prune it?
actually up through July. The high basically
Yeah,
there's different zones of risk. There's the high risk months are April 1st through July 15th. Then there's moderate risk, I think slightly before that, and then through the rest of the summer. And then it's lowest risk if you trim in the winter. And actually on the University of Minnesota Oak Wilt page, let me type that in. We have like a running we have like we post there frequently and like there's always posted on that page how high the risk is at that particular moment. And so if you're not sure, you can't remember, you can always visit that page and it will say this is what the risk level is right now. So it's usually pretty safe to prune after July, but there's still like a slight risk.
sure.
The when we usually encourage people to trim their trees, their oak trees for the most safety is in the winter months.
And then is that season of risk, that time when it can spread, growing due to climate change and warming
It may
conditions?
be. And actually, on that same page that I just shared, it links to a model that's created, I think, by the Wisconsin DNR. And so, if you want to get like really in the weeds about when exactly the risk is and how high it is exactly, you can type in your location in that area and it'll say, like, right now, at that location, this is what the risk level is. And so that model is based on like this year's weather patterns and calculations done based on like the accumulation of units of heat, essentially, which is a common method of that entomologists use to figure out when beetles are emerging of different species. And so there's detailed information there. I think theoretically it very well could be growing year to year. Um, I think realistically it's more dependent on the individual year. Just because we're on average seeing more heat doesn't mean that like without fail every single year it's now a longer season. It just means that there may be some years that are warmer years in which that risk comes a little earlier.
All right. Thank you so much. I think I'll encourage folks. I'll quick share my screen, Grace.
And
Um,
I can stop.
I think it'll just let me here. And so I encourage you to send additional questions to Grace, and she will try to get back to them. We tried to cover as most as we could and group them as we could. Um, and I see that we're now approaching 10 o'clock. So thank you so much again, Grace. I really appreciate your presentation, and it's super informative and really just highlights a problem that we're all concerned about, yet another fungus or stressor that is affecting some of our trees. I encourage you all to join our next Fridays with the Forester presentations in this webinar series. We'll skip a week on April 3rd and be back again on April 10th for growing and selling wood on private lands. We'll have David Knoll with the Minnesota Logger Education Program, and he will join Eli Sagor, the Extension Professor and Natural Resources Program Leader. Um, so we'll have three more webinars in this series in April. And we really look forward to seeing you all again on April 10th and can't thank you enough for joining us. So until then, take care and stay warm.
Bye, thanks everyone.